April 19, 2025 marked the 250th anniversary of the beginning of the American Revolution. Thousands gathered to commemorate, honor, and celebrate the enduring legacy of the Battles of Lexington, Concord, and Menotomy?
Everybody has heard of Lexington and Concord, and they really sort of get all the attention. But the biggest battle of the day was in fact later in what is known as the Battle of Menotomy, mostly focused around the Jason Russell farm in Arlington.
Lexington and Concord, everything that they talk about there also happened here, but it happened bigger and with more people, with more bloodshed.
This is the story of two Massachusetts towns who are trying to keep the memory of this battle alive. One by following in the steps of their forefathers.
We know the route, we know where they left from, and we know where they joined the battle. So all these pieces sort of fall into place.
The other by preserving the hallowed ground where the struggle took place.
I want them to know what happened here. I want them to know the significance of this site.
This is also a story about ordinary citizens and unlikely heroes who willingly stepped into the fray.
David Lamson, various sources call him mulatto. He organized the exempts who were left behind that morning. Sam Whittemore, who basically stages a one-man redoubt against the royal troops.
This is the story of the forgotten fight that happened right here. This is the story of the Battle of Menotomy.
Mr. Moderator.
Hey, Mr. Matthews. I'm great. How are you?
Your attention, please. Thank you for coming and welcome to the Needham History Center and Museum's first annual Needham to Arlington Walk.
Since 2019, Kevin Keene has led residents of the town of Needham, Massachusetts on an annual group walk. Held on a Saturday in April, this isn't merely for exercise or taking in the sights. It's a pilgrimage of sorts, a walk of remembrance in honor of the town ancestors who followed this same path 2.5 centuries ago. Yes, it is actually the exact same path the Needham Militia took on April 19, 1775. On that fateful day, Needham sent nearly 200 men to face the British Redcoats. 5 of them never returned.
Here at the Needham Cemetery, this monument was erected in 1851. It was dedicated to the 5 men from the town that died on April 19, 1775. Now, if you look at the text here, you'll notice that it says they fell at Lexington. The only thing is, none of these 5 men died at Lexington. They were all killed at Menotomy.
The Battle of Menotomy didn't get the same kind of recognition. So if you said in 1851, when the monument was erected, if you said they died at Menotomy, everybody say, where? Anatomy? What? You know, so Lexington, everybody said, oh yeah, okay, we get that.
Lexington and Concord have worked very hard over the years to make sure that Lexington and Concord are foremost in American attention. In fact, they fought with each other.
Learning about Needham's story at the Battle of Menotomy and sharing it with others has been a passion for Kevin Keene that started with a vacation to the Green Mountain State.
So I was on vacation in Vermont, and I thought, I'll bring a book. So I brought David Hackett Fisher's book, Paul Revere's Ride. It had been out for a few years. And the first day of the vacation, it was pouring. It rained every single day, and there's nothing to do in Vermont when it pours. And so I started reading the book. So by the end of the week, I had read the book twice, reread the appendices as well, studied every map. But in there were bits and pieces about what other towns did, and Needham popped up a few times. And it's like, oh, that's kind of cool. I talked to Gloria Grice at the Needham History Center Museum and asked her, like, do we know the road? What route did they take? And it turns out some in the Needham History Center had done the work years and years ago.
Now, it's important to point out that back in 1775, Needham's militia was actually formed into 3 companies of about 60 men each. The Minutemen Company, made up of the best and most mobile militiamen, the West Needham Company, which was made up of citizens from the area that would later become the town of Wellesley, and the East Needham Company, made up of citizens from the area that is the current town of Needham. each left for the Lexington alarm at different times and from different locations. But it is specifically the path of the East Needham Company that is traced by the Needham to Arlington Walk.
And we know the route. We know where they left from. We know where they joined the battle. For many towns, they just joined the battle along the road, somewhere, the Bay Road. But Needham, we know they joined at the Jason Russell House, which still stands and is the headquarters for the Arlington Historical Society.
Wait, did he just say the Arlington Historical Society? I thought we were talking about Menotomy. Well, to find out the answer, we're gonna have to jump down a rabbit hole.
So we are the town that had 3 different names. So we were incorporated in 1635, just a few months after Concord. It's believed that Menotomy comes from an indigenous term, specifically an Algonquin term. However, we've never been able to verify that 100%. In my opinion, I think it has maybe connections to what it believed to be clean rivers or fresh rivers, something along those variations. But I think if it is from indigenous terms, it's been anglicized to the point where it's not really recognizable. In 1807, as each town created their own meeting houses, we subdivided. It changed the name to West Cambridge because we are west of Cambridge. And then in 1867, they changed its name again to Arlington, which is named after the National Cemetery.
While Lexington and Concord have spent centuries preserving their iconic landscapes, the battlefield in Arlington has been swallowed up by the modern world, with only a few reminders of what happened there.
The most visible evidences are small, and they're scattered, and they're not regularly told in stories or tours. Some of it is. Of course, this house.
The Arlington Historical Society bought the property in 1923. And around this time, people, especially in the greater Boston area, started realizing they needed to preserve a lot of these historic houses. And then they've gone through extensive changes to revitalize the structure to the earliest point in the entire house. What we do here in the society is we like to show off the different time periods of the house and how it has evolved from 1740 all the way to the Federalist style in the late 1700s, early 1800s.
For Kevin Keene, learning about the Battle of Menotomy and Needham's part in it was not enough. He wanted to experience it and share that experience with others.
So I always thought it'd be interesting to walk the walk and to see if the road still exists, you know, like did 95 destroy it or something like that. But it turns out they were all secondary roads, so it all works. And so I got some friends, me and 2 other guys, Peter Tull and Greg Duthaller, so I did the walk as a test to see if it would work. And it was great. It was exhausting. It's 12.6 miles. And it is kind of amazing to arrive at the Jason Russell House. It's a bit like the El Camino de Santiago.
Starting in 2020, Kevin Keene has worked with the Needham History Center and Museum and the Arlington Historical Society to make the Walk to Arlington a public event. Unfortunately, due to COVID, the first walk was held privately. However, since then, the event has grown year by year. For 2025, they decided to go big.
Through delightful coincidence, it actually falls on the exact 250th anniversary of the Lexington alarm, April 19th, 2025. So we're doing a little bit extra. There is the walk for those of you that want to walk, but to allow more people to participate, because frankly, not everybody can or wants to walk 12.5 miles, we're also offering a bus. So it'll follow the same route. We don't normally do that, but we want more people to be able to join us this year.
And then there we will have packed lunch provided by Valenti Farms and the Needham Rotary, tours of the Jason Russell House, and then the VFW is going to have a wreath-laying ceremony, which is kind of good just to honor the 5 that died at the Jason Russell Farm. And then people in the bus get a ride back to Needham because they bought a ticket. People who walked, just like the Boston Marathon, after you run the Boston Marathon, you find your own way home.
In 1763, Britain, along with her allies, had emerged victorious in the 7 Years' War. Spanning several continents, some historians view the struggle as the true first global conflict.
This is all part of a world war between England and France. It's fought in 11, 12 different theaters of battle. The English have won. The English have defeated the French. Canada is now English. The Northern American colonies are secure from French attack. And the Royal Treasury is nearly bankrupt. So now the colonials are going to have to pay for the cost of protecting them from the French.
To Britain, it seemed only fair that the colonies should pay their fair share. How could they object to that? Well, many living in New England did object. It wasn't that they didn't want to pay taxes, they actually paid a lot more taxes to their local governments. However, what they did object to was having no say in the matter, no representation.
All we want is our rights as Englishmen. That if we are to be taxed, we tax ourselves. If we are to be ruled by law, we pass those laws ourselves. It's not the way London saw it. London saw it as, we've been carrying you guys for a long time. We have spent blood and treasure to defend you against the native savages on your border, against the barbarous French who would have conquered you all. Wholly prejudicial view, but that's the way it was told in London.
By the early 1770s, those who were crying, "No taxation without representation," had become the majority in Massachusetts.
There were some very ardent, we would call them patriots in Arlington, which we take on the evidence of the sermons that the minister in the Congregational Church, he preached strongly for independence. It was clear he was preaching to his congregation. So we figured that the congregation had to have been with him or they would have ridden him out of town. So yeah, we think that Menotomy was pro-independence. But that doesn't mean that everybody was.
In stark contrast to Menotomy, Needham's minister warned his congregation of the dangers of rebellion.
Samuel West was our second minister, and he was a Harvard-educated, as all ministers in this area were. You got your divinity degrees from Harvard. And he was pretty much a Tory. As he describes in his memoir, he thought obedience to the crown was the best policy.
This sentiment seems to have been shared by the rest of the residents of Needham, as evidenced by their response when a certain committee came knocking at the door.
By the early 1770s, the Sons of Liberty had formed, and they were forming what they called committees of correspondence, which was essentially a network of communication between the various towns, so they could know what was going on all over the place and coordinate activity. Committee of Correspondence is a boring title, but you don't say, let's form a committee of spies, let's form a committee of agents, let's form a committee of, traitorous rebels. So you give it a sort of boring name, you hide it within the town administrative structure and, hope that it flies under the radar a little bit. In 1773, they actually sent out messages to all what was then the 220 towns of Massachusetts, asking them to form their own committees, and 206 towns responded positively and formed a committee. And of the 14 remaining towns, Needham was one. Needham refused to form a committee of correspondence.
But the residents of Needham would soon change their minds. On December 16, 1773, in defiance of the Tea Act, the Sons of Liberty, some of whom were disguised as Mohawks, boarded 3 merchant ships docked in Boston Harbor and dumped over 340 chests of tea into the sea. In retaliation, Britain's Parliament levied 5 punitive laws intended to curb rebellion. Instead, these laws had the opposite effect.
They weren't called the oppressive acts for nothing. England called them the coercive acts. The colonists called them the intolerable acts, closing the port of Boston and sending troops to be quartered in the city. And if any of that sounds familiar, you've heard it every time the Declaration of Independence is read out. Many of the grievances that are cited first, top of the page, by Jefferson come from those acts in Massachusetts where the King and Parliament were trying to pressure the colonials into obeying. And they swayed a lot of people in the other direction.
Even Needham went from being essentially a Tory town to being a revolutionary town. Samuel West, as he saw the changes happening in the laws and the effect it was having on the towns, he began to realize that he really had to let his parish take the lead and he would act as was best in their interest. And it came to be that in their best interest was rebellion.
1774 saw the British ramp up their efforts to crush rebellion. General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, called on his Redcoat regulars to make lightning strike expeditions across the New England countryside. Gage hoped these raids would seize enough gunpowder, ammunition, and weapons to strip the colonists of their ability to use their militia.
The militia was the only real form of defense. Villages were not that close together. They were fairly scattered. There was no standing army other than the British regulars, and they were not that widespread. So from the 1600s, towns were responsible for their own defense. Every able-bodied man over the age of 16 had to be part of the militia. Minister was exempted, blacksmiths were exempted, and you were supposed to train every week. And one company had to be designated called the Minute Company. And the Minute Company were the first responders. They had to be ready, in the sort of traditional way we think of Minutemen, gun loaded and by the door, ready to respond as soon as there's an alarm. And their job was essentially to hold things off until everybody else could go to the powder house and get their ammunition and get ready to go. So to mitigate that delay, the Minute Company responded first. The militia would then join in.
This is Townsend Green in Needham, which in 1775 was the town common. Like many New England towns, this would have been the place where the militia would muster and train together. Now, some of us might imagine that these militia were all crack shots and experts at guerrilla warfare, but for the majority of New England's militia, that couldn't be further from the truth.
They were not that good at handling their weapons, for the most part. I mean, they practiced theoretically every week, but because powder and shot were expensive, they very often didn't practice loading and shooting their muskets. So their training could be pretty sketchy.
I think he used the expression that they were emotionally ready but not physically ready, or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Samuel West is watching these, these are his flock. he's their shepherd, he's tending them, in that good old, Puritan church mindset, and he sees them. The training ground was right outside his house, so he could see them training. He knew that they were not ready. I think we underestimate how gutsy this was. We really do. We sort of think they're just ready to go, but this was such a leap of faith. They were badly trained farmers taking on the best army in the world. It wasn't a high percentage chance.
So we're finally here. It's April 19th, 2025, Kevin. We finally made it, and how are things looking?
Looking great.
So how many people signed up for this year?
56 walkers, 31 people on the bus.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so this is the biggest we've had ever for this event.
Yeah,
Okay,
this is
okay.
great.
So how did you hear about the event?
My daughter knows that I like to walk, and she knows I'm interested in history, so she thought this would be up my alley.
And why are you coming on this trip?
We got to celebrate 250 years, right? What a great day it's going to be.
Proud daughter-in-law of Robert Larson, who would be very happy that I'm here today since he was a patriot.
It's funny, I've lived in this town for over 20 years and I knew nothing of this.
We learned about this in history books, right? But to actually find out that a town that we are living in now had a part of this history, I think is really important.
Kevin's so amazing for organizing this.
So we're going to be leaving at 8:45. What time did the actual militia leave from here?
It's complicated.
Oh, it's complicated.
All right, so the Reverend West says 10 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
But we're in daylight savings time, so we're saying 9 o'clock. So there we go. So we're going off at 8:45, 9 o'clock. So that'll be a good start.
But before we head off on this walk, let's turn back the clock to April 1775. For several months, General Gage had been attempting to quell rebellion before it started. He had used his troops to seize gunpowder, weapons, and any other munitions that the New Englanders could use against him. But the colonists quickly caught on to his plans, hiding their weapons and thus foiling his attempts at disarming them. General Gage knew that further attempts to use his troops could incite war, but he also had to listen to the will of Parliament, who demanded that any traces of dissent be silenced now. So when General Gage learned of a large munitions store in the town of Concord, he felt that he had no choice but to take action. The expedition began on April 18, 1775, at around 10 p.m., when British soldiers were awakened and mustered near the docks in Boston. But the mission was plagued by errors from the start.
It took hours to get the troops mustered in Boston, and then they cross over the harbor. They get rowed across, except there aren't enough rowboats to take them all over. They have to send a second trip of the rowboats. They lose 90 minutes just in getting over to East Cambridge. They land in East Cambridge. They land in a marsh. They landed there because they knew that this guy Phipps was a loyalist. So let's land on the shore of his farm on the coast. Well, Phipps's farm in East Cambridge was nothing but marshes for hundreds of yards out to the ocean. So the troops have to wade in waist deep in icy water in the middle of the night in April to get to shore. And then they've got to get dried off, and then they're waiting for their supplies to come, and then they finally get on the march. So all of these accumulated delays are adding up, and they're falling further and further behind time.
Worse yet, before the first British soldier had mustered at the docks, word of Gage's plans had already started to spread. That night, Joseph Warren dispatched Paul Revere and William Dawes to spread the word that the regulars were on the move.
Revere came through Menotomy. Dawes came through Menotomy. We know that the first contingent of troops came through Menotomy around 2 in the morning. Revere was 2 hours ahead of that. By dawn, we know that the Menotomy captain and lieutenant were mustering their Minutemen right here in town and heading for Lexington.
The message came to us here in Needham a couple of times, actually. We were notified 3 times, one way or another. One was a rider coming over Kendrick's Bridge, which is the bridge on Kendrick Street from Newton. He's just described as the rider without any hat on, and he's thought to be one of the Dawes messengers. Came through and notified us. A British deserter coming through town said the regulars are on the move, and that was how West Needham was notified. And then a black man, a freed slave named Nero Benson, was described as blowing his trumpet and riding his horse through what was then called the Needham Leg, which is a section of Natick that was at that point part of Needham. So we had 3 riders, a West Needham rider, an East Needham rider, and a Needham Leg rider in the course of that morning.
As is evident in the case of Needham, the alarm of April 18th and 19th was not carried out by Paul Revere alone, but by an entire network of messengers.
It's essentially what we think of as like a phone tree. You notify a couple of people, and they notify a couple of people, and they notify a couple of people, and then, it continues to spread. So what we think of sort of Revere and Dawes as running all over the place, they weren't. They were running to hubs and getting a bunch of other people informed so other people could head out and spread the news.
They've called it the Lexington Alarm. A very famous historian, David Hackett Fisher, who wrote the history Paul Revere's Ride, expanded on that to call it the Middlesex Alarm, because it really was a network of riders and messengers all over Middlesex County. In the 30 years, though, since that work was published, we know it was even bigger. It went all through Essex County as well, all the way up to Lynn and Salem, and obviously to Needham and Dedham. So this alarm covered 4 counties, spread all over eastern Massachusetts.
The British soldiers would pass through Menotomy at around 2 a.m. By this time, word of their arrival was already spreading like wildfire, and the commander of the expedition knew that the element of surprise had already been lost.
The first contingent, the 700 under Lieutenant Colonel Smith, came marching right up Massachusetts Avenue. And Smith senses that everything's wrong because everybody's already in hiding, 2 o'clock in the morning, and nobody's looking at him. You'd think that 700 troops marching up a colonial road would turn out at least a few people thinking, what is this? Before they get to Lexington, Smith already knows that his cover's blown.
In Lexington, at around 5 a.m., the first shots of the American Revolutionary War would ring out as the British drove the town militia from Lexington Green. A few hours later, they arrived in Concord and secured and destroyed what military supplies they could find. Unfortunately for them, most of it had already been moved and hidden elsewhere. Later on at the North Bridge in Concord, the British troops would again clash with the Colonials. This time, however, it would be the British running with their tails between their legs. Most of this had taken place before the first of Needham's militia had even started on the Battle Road.
They were assembled at the minister's house for their ammunition by 9 o'clock and on the road by 10. One later testimony mentions that Lieutenant John Bacon, who had fought in the French and Indian War, he's in his 50s, couldn't wait. It was like, let's go, let's go, let's go. He was a Minuteman. He was just ready to get on the road, and they're saying like, wait, we're not ready.
Skipping ahead 250 years, and our modern-day militia is anxious to hit the road as well. And after a few opening remarks, we finally are on our way. So as we're walking along here, we're wearing nice, comfortable clothes, comfortable sneakers, cotton, linen. But back in 1775, the militia, they wouldn't have been wearing anything as comfortable as that.
These guys did it in heavy clothing, carrying all of their weapons, their powder, their food and pots and their heavy packs, all their equipment, in their uncomfortable colonial shoes, which in those days weren't made as left and rights. They were just straight. So your feet sort of wore them into shape over time, but these were not comfortable shoes.
All right, 9 more miles to go. This is a brand new Mills Bridge. It was built just shortly before the Needham Militias marched on it. On this route, the East Needham Militia was walking down. Ahead of us was the Needham Minute Company, and then the West Needham Militia was coming from Wellesley Center, and they were taking what's now Washington Street, and so all effectively combining the routes here. On an old map, it says this is a waiting spot. So I guess when the bridge wasn't built, you would just wade across. But the bridge existed, they took it, it's named the Mills Bridge, not because there were 7 mills around here, because there's a Mills family. This is also the edge of Needham, of old Needham. So all you wonder what happened and how big the town was. This used to be Needham. We're gonna cross this bridge, we're gonna go over 95. You stay on the south side, be very careful. There are crosswalks to an island to get across. So everyone be like high alert.
By the time Needham's troops were finally crossing the border of their town, the British Army should have already been back in Boston. But because of the pileup of delays, they were only just now beginning their march back home.
And this is how the Battle of Menotomy can happen. The Royal troops were so far behind what they should have been doing, they should have been home by then.
Earlier that morning, Colonel Smith, realizing that their cover was blown, had sent a rider back to Boston asking for reinforcements. The rider had to deliver a separate message to each of the commanders of line infantry, artillery, and Marines. Unfortunately, the whole column is delayed when the commander of the Marines cannot be found.
They call for foot soldiers, infantry, and they call for more Marines. So they take a message and they put it on the desk in the quarters of the major of the Marines, Pitcairn. They put the orders on his desk, send more Marines. Where's Pitcairn? Pitcairn's already in Lexington. He's left already. The orders sit on his desk for almost 2 hours until some orderly or aide realizes that might be important, opens it up, reads it, and realizes, oh, they want the Marines to turn out too. It's comical in one sense, but it's also deadly, because the longer it takes this expedition to get anywhere, the more colonials arrive, and they are engaging the Royal troops wherever they can find them.
But the Needham Militia still had a long way to go before running into the British. In Watertown, they would stop for refreshments and to receive updates on where they should be headed.
This is Watertown Square. The Minutemen got here and met Joseph Welch, the tax collector from Watertown, and he led them up a certain way, and they went up to Lexington. Shortly after that happened, there was a new command, like, no one go up to Lexington. The battle's gonna be now moved to the Bay Road. So all militias coming after were directed the way we're going, which is up towards Arlington. You are gonna go up what we call the Heartbreak Hill of this walk. It's a little steep. It's not a race. But in the day, it would have been really great to go, because imagine that this landscape is now denuded of trees because everyone cuts down their trees, and you could probably start seeing the battle, and you could probably see where the British column was, and you could see where the other militias were coming in.
By 2 p.m., Colonel Smith's regulars had fought their way back to Lexington. They were hungry, exhausted, and possibly outnumbered by more than 2 to 1. Just when all hope seemed lost, the relief column finally arrived.
Some of the actual foot soldiers wrote about it that day, saying that there was no more jubilation than could be imagined than when Percy showed up with 1,100 reinforcements and 2 cannon. And the first thing he does is send a couple of cannonballs flying into Lexington, right through the meeting house in the center of town, just to tell the colonials, you're gonna back off right here. And the royal troops give them a grand huzzah, and they fall on the ground with their tongues hanging out like dogs. One of them said, they're saved, or they thought they were saved. Percy was the kind of leader that his soldiers wanted to follow, and he knew tactics and he knew strategy. Smith's orders were to go light and fast. You're carrying 30 shots, 36 shots in a cartridge bag. That was it for the entire day. And most of Smith's troops had expended all of their ammunition and shot by the time they were rescued. So Percy comes in with fresh troops and supply wagons, but the supply wagons are heavy and they can't travel as fast as the soldiers and Marines that Percy has under his command. The wagons fall behind. And as the wagons fall behind, colonials, they go racing up today's Mass Ave to Menotomy, saying that 1,100 strong relief column, they're not all. There are supply wagons coming too. And so the soldiers in Menotomy, who were officially exempt from turning out at the first alarm, organized themselves. You were exempted if you were too old, if you were not in fighting shape, if you had any sort of infirmment or disability. You also were exempt if you weren't a citizen. And that meant if you weren't a white, property-owning, church-going man. Best we can tell, the exempts of Menotomy, who were nicknamed the Old Men later on, were organized into this platoon and staged the ambush under the direction of a man who was exempted because he wasn't white, David Lamson. Various sources call him mulatto, typical term of the day for somebody of mixed race. Yet he was a veteran of, as was known in the colonies, the French and Indian Wars. 20 years before, he had solid military experience. So he organized the exempts who were left behind that morning, staged them where they wouldn't be seen, taught them. First one was going to tell the drivers of the wagons to stand and deliver, and if they run, we're going to shoot. And that's what they did. The Teamsters were ordered to halt and give up their wagons, so they whipped their horses, and the colonials fired, and they killed the horses, and killed some of the drivers. They dragged the horses off the road so that the evidence wouldn't be there later on in the day, and they took the gunpowder, and they took the shot.
We went the wrong way. Who led us astray?
So it was his fault.
It's your fault?
I made the mistake and I am correcting the mistake.
We did it!
You did it! Congratulations. How's it feel?
Awesome. Absolutely awesome. It's a great accomplishment. Who thought we would walk 12.6 miles?
For all of us who arrived at the Jason Russell House, it marked the end of our journey. But for those making it here 250 years ago, this was only the beginning of their longest day. After regrouping in Lexington, the British column was back on the road by the mid-afternoon with renewed morale. Not only had the reinforcements more than doubled their numbers, but they also had a new commanding officer.
Lieutenant Colonel Smith's men, they've been up since 10:30 the night before. They are tired, so General Percy, he takes command of the entire army. And the goal is to get this column back to Boston.
But in order to get home, the British would have to run the gauntlet of colonial militia that was forming at Menotomy.
I think it's timing as much as anything. The Army's coming one way and our militias are catching up and being sent up to that area. I don't think it had anything to do with Menotomy per se. I think it's simply just the place where they managed to converge.
At 4:30 p.m., Needham's Minute Company joined with the militia of Menotomy and other towns to give the Redcoats a warm welcome.
It was here, at the foot of the rocks, that the first fighting within the borders of Menotomy took place. Up this road, Mass Ave, leads to Lexington. The British were marching down along here into Menotomy. The colonial militia, including Needham's Minute Company, took up defensive positions among the natural terrain here. They waited for the British to approach, and then when they're close enough, they fired.
We know the Minute Company joined there. And then there's some reports that like running ahead and reinserting themselves into the battle somewhere down the road. I'm gonna suggest they know what they're doing and they're eager to do it. And they're eager to jump into the fray and get so dangerously close to the column.
But the British are able to push through, thanks in no small part to Percy's decision to deploy some of the light infantry as skirmishers to protect his flanks and to outflank the colonial militia.
Percy, being the consummate professional soldier, knows that if you are marching a column through hostile territory, you have a van of soldiers in the middle, you have a vanguard in front, you have heavy weapons at the back to prevent oncoming troops from overtaking you there, and you have troops on both flanks. And you have flankers who are doing the exhausting work of tromping through fields and over fences and over trees and through orchards and things like that, about 60, 70, 100 yards on either side of the road, bushwhacking as it were, but looking for colonial soldiers. And if they're out there, if they're shooting at the van, the main column, they're going to get them first.
Many civilians in town had already fled, but those who remained found themselves in the crosshairs of the battle.
Deacon Joseph Adams, he had his house just down the street. He was a patriot. He believed during that day that he was going to get arrested, that the British regulars, they were there to arrest people who spoke patriotic sermons. He escapes his home and flees and eventually hides behind a rock and then eventually goes out to his friend Samuel Cook's house, who is the reverend of the first parish. His wife, Hannah, gave birth about 10 days before the battle. Now with 18th century medicine, unfortunately she was bedridden at this point. She could barely move. She's there with her newborn child, Anna, as well as 5 other kids who are in the house. As the British regulars get into Menotomy, they notice that there's a lot of provincials that are hiding in other residences.
Pretty much from the foot of the rocks down through the rest of Menotomy, the orders were, if it moves, shoot it. If you have fire coming from houses, break every house. Go in, anybody you find is a combatant, and you kill them all.
3 British regulars, they enter their home and they hold Hannah up at gunpoint. And they said, "We will not kill you as long as he cooperates." They go throughout the house and they loot a lot of things. They rip out a page of their family Bible, light a fire into their kitchen, which sparks and grows, engulfs into a bigger fire. Hannah escapes and she runs out of the door and hides in her barn, whereas her other children, they pop up underneath the bed where they're hiding, and with homebrewed beer, they douse the fire.
All things considered, Hannah and her children were relatively unharmed. However, some civilians were not so lucky.
At Cooper's Tavern, a couple of the older residents of Menotomy, one of them had just had a grandchild and they were toasting each other, and they told the Coopers, the tavern keepers, "Don't worry about us. They're not coming in here." And they did. The royal soldiers came in and bashed their brains out on the very floor.
But not every civilian fled or hid. Some decided to fight back.
This is my personal favorite story. Samuel Whittemore, we do know he was an older gentleman, anywhere between 72 to about 82, so he's unfit for service. But the story is that he goes and grabs his musket and some other swords and bayonets, and he goes out and waits for the British regulars as they cross the border from Lexington into Menotomy. And he waits there behind a stone wall.
According to his obituary, he basically takes on the whole royal army and kills 3 of them before they leave him shot and bayoneted and left for dead. Which he didn't die. Dr. Cotton Tufts of Medford, even though he said there's nothing I can do for him, dressed his wounds and he went on to live for another 18 years.
As the battle progresses down Mass Ave, more militia pour into town. Many of these companies take position around a farm owned by Jason Russell.
The Russells had lived in Arlington for generations. Jason was a farmer. Everybody was a farmer. 58 or 59 years old, and 6 of his children had grown to adulthood. The youngest 2 were still living here in the family farmhouse. He was exempt from military service because he was really close to that age where he would have aged out anyway, and most of the local accounts said that he was lame.
While Menotomy was a patriotic town, Jason Russell's sympathies were unclear.
It's uncertain because we don't have a whole lot of personal testimony from Jason. Jason just wasn't an important figure before the war came to his house.
So why did he decide to stay and fight?
Again, it's an anecdote. But according to his friend Cutter, he tried to grab Jason and tell him to leave. And it was no place for a 58 or 59-year-old guy who didn't run well to be. And supposedly, according to Cutter, Jason said,
"An Englishman's home is his castle!"
And he wouldn't leave. He had taken his family to safety already, and he'd come back. He wanted to look after the house, and he wanted to do what he could to keep it safe. So whether or not he actually said those words, well, the Cutter family has said for centuries that he did. And basically through the memoirs and the histories that the Cutters wrote of themselves, he said that an Englishman's home is his castle, and I'm not leaving.
Jason Russell's actions that day spoke louder than any words he might have said. He was joined at his home by several militia groups, including those who came from Needham.
East Needham shows up. There was a burn in the Jason Russell house. They think it's the same approximate footprint of where their existing exhibit space is. Some were in there, and some may have been other sheds, barns, or whatever, thinking they could get close and fire into the column.
But the militia, who thought they had the drop on the British, soon discovered that the British had the drop on them. After getting off one round of fire, a flanking party came in from behind the militia, causing mass panic. Jason Russell himself was caught in the middle of it.
Jason set himself up behind what he thought was a defensive position in his farm, a stack of shingles or something that he was going to crouch behind and aim his musket from.
And this is when you think, oh, I didn't know wooden shingles had a military use. And it turns out they don't. He was absolutely wrong. It was a horrible idea.
Jason Russell was well within the range of the flanking party on the south side of the Battle Road of Massachusetts Avenue, and he was surrounded and killed. We know the battle happened here. It surrounded the house. It came inside the house as colonials who were fighting in this farm ran to the house for shelter, and the Royal troops followed them right inside.
They go into the Jason Russell house and they hide in essentially their basement. As they wait, they point their muskets upward. 2 British regulars enter the door into the kitchen, the room where we are now, and they fire, killing those 2 regulars right on the spot.
Those who fled into the basement held off the British and eventually managed to escape. But any militia caught in the rest of the house was ruthlessly hunted down and killed.
It was a slaughter. The ones who didn't make it into the basement were killed in the very rooms that we've walked through earlier today, perhaps after they had dropped their own weapons too. We have a letter from one of the Royal soldiers saying that, well, of course we had to put them all to death. They had taken up arms against the king, and one of them cursed us in the most foul language of a very Cromwellian, Cromwellian being an epithet for somebody who would take up arms against the king. We killed him too.
Elizabeth Russell, who is Jason's wife, when she comes back, she sees 13 dead bodies in her kitchen, including that of her husband. Even though this is very traumatizing for her, she still didn't fix a lot of the holes that were in the structure, and she just lived with them.
We've had an expert in colonial firearms and forensics do a study of this very property, and according to his research, there are at least 12 or 13 musket ball strikes in various places in the house. Some of them, which can be proven to have come from the outside. The very window that I'm looking out right there was shot up, and the hole that the ball made is in the opposite wall. We know it was fired in from just outside the house. We know that there are other musket ball strikes in the house that had to have been fired from inside the room. Now put yourself on the side of a parade where the troops come marching down in their colonial costumes, and they load their black powder, and they ceremoniously stand and aim and fire, and what an explosion of sound that makes. Now imagine it's in your kitchen and it's happening inside your own house. And the smoke and the black powder are filling up the rooms, and the sparks and the fire that's coming out of these muskets. The battle is actually happening in these rooms that we're sitting in today.
After driving the colonists from Jason Russell's farm, the British did not stay long. Many more militia units were streaming in, including the West Needham Company, who arrived just as the rest of the Needham troops were fleeing. Wanting to escape back to Boston before sunset, the British continued down Mass Ave, hotly pursued by the militia.
It's amazing how good the soldiering was now that Percy was in command, because even though there were these atrocities that happened all through Menotomy, he gets them together and keeps them marching. They go further down the battle road. He gets to a spot in North Cambridge, receives word from one of his scouts that Old Cambridge, the Harvard Square area, they've turned out and they're waiting for us. And they've torn up the planks on the old bridge over the Charles River. So they have destroyed the bridge. There's no marching home that way. So in North Cambridge, around Porter Square or so, Percy decides we're taking a different route. They take a left turn onto Beach Street in North Cambridge, and then right turn on today's Somerville Ave to go to Charlestown. It's almost sunset by the time they get to the shore of Charlestown by the harbor, and they just sleep on their guns that night, and the rowboats come for them the next morning.
When the battle was over, it was time for the grim job of counting the dead. In total, the colonial militia suffered 93 casualties, including 49 killed. 25 of those died within the borders of Menotomy.
Menotomy was the most deadly stretch of that day. Of the British fatalities, more than half were in Arlington. And the same thing with the Americans. More than half were in Arlington, and then in Arlington, more than half were at the Jason Russell House. So you almost can't overstate how violent the Jason Russell House battle was.
Needham had one of the highest casualty totals, with 5 dead and 2 wounded.
For a couple of them, we actually have some anecdotal information. John Bacon was fighting with a comrade known as Old Hawes, Joseph Hawes, with whom he had been fighting during the French and Indian War, and they were fighting together. And Hawes saw the British patrols coming up behind and said, get out of here. And Hawes got away fast enough, but Bacon didn't. Amos Mills was fighting from a barn somewhere between the foot of the rocks and the Jason Russell House along the road. And when he stepped out to fire, he was shot. 2 of them, Nathaniel Chamberlain and Elisha Mills, we just knew were shot. We didn't know what happened. And then Jonathan Parker was fighting from the barn at the Jason Russell House when the British came up behind him, and the guy he was with said, "Let's run for it." They tried to get to the woodlots behind the house, and Parker wasn't successful.
One of the bodies, that of Elisha Mills, was brought back to Needham. The other 4 were buried in a mass grave in Arlington. When news of the battle reached Needham, Minister Samuel West had the unpleasant task of informing the families of those who'd lost a loved one.
He talks about having to notify the families, which he found very hard, needless to say. All of these guys were married, and all of them had kids. At least 3 kids. One had 6, one had 11. In fact, for John Bacon, who had 11 kids, he had 3 sons fighting with him in the militia that day, and who went into the Continental Army later. Then he just talks about that real sense of anxiety, because they are expecting the British to come back. They're expecting revenge. And they saw what happened along the Menotomy Road with the British entering houses and just bayoneting everybody they found. What happens if, they're angry and they reform and they come back up the road? We've got this little village, and you could have the British Army in everybody's house, pillaging and attacking and killing people. And that was a real fear for them. And he talks about this. This was the most anxious day he could ever remember. I'm sure for a few days, until they realized it wasn't happening. Never did I know a more anxious day than this.
But one of the most astounding things that happened that day was that many of the militia, who were only required to defend their local towns, volunteered to stay for the siege of Boston.
That's probably the most long-term significance of what happened here in Menotomy. Lexington basically fought a defensive action. Concord was a defensive action. But here in Menotomy, soldiers from all of these towns who never met each other, who weren't related to each other, they weren't family, they weren't blood defending blood, as so many of the first soldiers of the morning were. But the soldiers who were here in Menotomy fought not under a unified command, but under a unified purpose of expelling their own royal troops from the area. And they stayed together. And they ended up being the first of the 15, eventually 20,000 colonial soldiers who camped out on all of the high places of the hills surrounding Boston Harbor afterwards, and put into effect the siege that kept General Gage's troops stuck in the town of Boston and into the next year. There was no expectation that morning that they would stay. The idea was we respond to the alarm, we defend our homes and our hearths, and then we go back and do what we do, making a living, farming, raising our families. But the soldiers who streamed into Menotomy formed the core of this army that didn't go home.
So now we're in front of the monument for the mass grave to the colonists that died that day. So can you tell me about this?
Sure. This obelisk was erected in 1848. The first grave where 12 colonials were just dumped, really, mostly wearing the same clothes that they died in, was approximately here, the very day after they were all killed. I've got to think that the entire village was in profound shock and mourning, and because of that and because of the health exigencies of the time, everybody was just buried as quickly as they could.
So where's the Jason? Oh, we're still
right
out
here.
there.
Jason was the only one of the 12 buried here right after the Battle of Menotomy who received his own headstone. And it's right over here. This was his wife, and here's Jason. It's a little hard to read in the shadows here. Mr. Jason Russell was barbarously murdered in his own home. There's no born, died here. There's nothing traditional about this. This stone, or the inscription on it, was written and the stone was carved in the grief and the rage that the community was feeling. Mr. Jason Russell was barbarously murdered in his own home by Gage's bloody troops. They didn't have to explain who Gage was. Murdered by Gage's bloody troops on the 19th of April, 1775, aetatis, another Latin abbreviation, the age of 59. His body is quietly resting in this grave with 11 of our friends who, in like manner with many others, were cruelly slain on that fatal day. Blessed are they who rest in the Lord. This tombstone is a battle cry. And in death, as in life, he lies next to Elizabeth, who lived his widow for another 11 years. So he's memorialized both as a soldier and patriot, as well as husband and father. A couple of his children are in here too. Many of his neighbors, the men that he died alongside. This is hallowed ground.
Here's a question. Should the battle be renamed the Battle of Lexington Concord in Menotomy?
I wouldn't go that far, because that would require rebranding a lot of what some excellent, dedicated historians and guides and interpreters are doing today, telling the story of Lexington and of Concord. I'd like to put Menotomy, the Battle of Menotomy, right up there next to them, because it's the rest of the day. It's the rest of the battle. It's, not to be macabre about this, it's the majority of the bloodshed, and it's where the most gripping and propagandistic descriptions of the battle, if I can use that sort of word. It's where they emanate from.
I'll say I'm not from Arlington, and from my tenure so far, I've come to know that a lot of the people in Arlington, they take great pride in the provincials who took a stand and their sacrifice that they made right in their own home. They understand exactly what happened here, and they understand that this is the largest portion of the entire battle, and they want people to know that.
When studying the American Revolution, it's easy to get caught up in all the famous figures like George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. But what the Battle of Menotomy teaches us is that the real heroes of the Revolution were ordinary people from small towns like Needham, Arlington, or maybe even yours.
People don't personalize history. So even if they are, sort of good students of history and they read about it and they're interested in it, and they don't really think about it affecting themselves very often. It's a rare person to say, what would I do in that situation? What if this were me? And by having people walk the same route that the militia walked, obviously they're not walking it with the same trepidation and fears that the militia had, but they're walking a fairly arduous route, and they're seeing a little bit what it was like to be in this position on that day, anticipating what was happening.
We should be really proud of what Needham did on April 19, 1775. It was heroic and spectacular, and it was daring, and it came at great cost to them. But what they were doing was they were fighting for self-government, to preserve their town meeting, their colony's charter, the rule of law, and they're fighting against a king or a tyrant. And I think today you take those lessons back and say, they fought for them 250 years ago. Would we do the same?
We who look upon this with a historical eye have to remind ourselves they didn't know what the next month was going to bring, let alone 7 years, 8 years. Here's the situation. Here's what many people are feeling. Here's what other people are feeling. You have no idea how this will end. Do you march off? Or do you try to keep your family and farm going right here? Do you sign on with the colonial army, or do you stay? If you sign on and you lose, you will be marked as a traitor for the rest of your life. You'll probably have to leave. You'll probably have to move far away. You'll never see your family again if you survive. So would you go?
These big events, they don't just sprout. They happen because towns like Needham really sort of churn and agonize over these issues for years and years until there's some break point that causes these upheavals to happen, to spark up. So you get this sort of, well, nothing ever happened here. It's like, no, everything happened here. Everything happened here because it doesn't happen out there until it happens here.